Hello friends, welcome or welcome back to my channel. If you're new here, my name's Han, I'm a hand embroidery artist. I specialize in shoe embroidery and today's video is going to be a super in-depth, beginner-friendly Converse embroidery tutorial. I do also have a downloadable PDF embroidery guide that can work as a really great accompaniment to this video tutorial. I'll have that linked in the description of this video. This particular design is my something blue bridal Converse design, but these don't have to be limited to bridal wear. I actually have a lot of people that order these on a weekly basis who are not brides, and you can also switch the color scheme up however you want it. So don't worry if you are not a bride, you can still embroider this design and wear these shoes on a daily basis. This is one of the longest tutorials I've ever filmed on this channel, and if you aren't already, I definitely consider subscribing to my channel so that you don't miss any of my upcoming embroidery tutorials. Okay, so I'm quickly going to run you through all of the supplies that you'll need to complete this embroidery project. As always, I'll have them linked in the description of this video as well. First up, you're going to need some embroidery needles. I love these ones from Amazon. They're a no-name brand, but they come with 30 different sized needles in this little convenient container, and I believe they're under $4, so a real steal. DMC also makes some really good embroidery needles, but honestly, an embroidery needle is an embroidery needle. You don't need a special one for shoe embroidery. That's a common misconception. Next up, you'll need something to sketch out this design onto the shoes. I won't be using a marker today because I do it so often. I know where everything goes at this point. The downloadable PDF I have linked in the description of this video has a bunch of pictures and sketches and super helpful information for how to sketch this design out onto a pair of shoes. This tutorial is more so just going to be showing you how to complete all of the stitches. I 100% recommend this Dritz disappearing embroidery marker. I recommend using the blue side as it disappears when it comes into contact with water. It's super forgiving and you can use it for a bunch of different embroidery projects. Next up is something I don't often mention in my tutorials, but you will need somewhere to keep your needle when you're not embroidering, especially if you embroider on the couch, in bed, or in a room that has carpet on the floor. It's so easy to accidentally drop a needle, and if you can't find it, it could end up wedged into your foot or a different body part, so you definitely need somewhere to keep your needles when you're not using them. I have a couple of pin cushions, but this one is my favorite. It used to be my nana's. A non-negotiable supply for shoe embroidery is finger protectors. These ones are silicone and they just slip onto the ends of your fingers. These protect the skin on your fingers and they also give you a little bit of extra grip when pulling the needle through the shoe. You can get ones that are made out of different fabric, but these are my favorite. I don't feel like I'm wearing anything on my fingers and they don't slow me down when I'm embroidering. Next, you will need a pair of scissors. I always recommend a small sharp pair of scissors, but you don't need to go out and buy a new pair of scissors for this embroidery project. If you have some scissors in your kitchen, those are totally fine as well. And you'll also be needing some embroidery thread. I store my thread on these little clothes pegs. This is DMC thread and I write the number of the thread on the end of the clothes peg. Again, you can choose a different color scheme for your embroidery project. These are just the colors that I'm going to be using today. And lastly, you will need a pair of shoes. These shoes that I'm working on today are a pair of monochrome white Chuck All-Stars. They're just a pair of Converse shoes that are made of a canvas material. These shoes are super popular with brides because they're all white. And firstly, we're going to need to prep the shoe, and that basically just involves unlacing the shoe and tucking the tongue of the shoe under the front portion toe cap. I recommend that you completely unlace your shoes. Just take the laces all the way out because this removes the risk of you accidentally embroidering through one of the laces when you're working towards the toe cap of the shoe. It's really easy to do this. It's also really easy to accidentally embroider onto the tongue if you don't tuck it away properly. Next, we have to prep our embroidery thread. Embroidery thread usually comes in one large strand made up of 6 smaller strands. In order to achieve dainty, neat stitches, you have to split these 6 strands apart. For these first few stitches with this light blue color, I only need 2 strands, so I'm going to strip those away from the remaining 4. In the downloadable PDF that I make, I go through all of the strand densities in a lot of detail, but I'll also be reminding you whenever I thread my needle with a new color of how many strands I'm using for that specific color. Once I've split away my 2 strands, it's time to thread my needle, and also don't forget to put a couple of knots in the opposite end of the thread. This is going to make sure it doesn't travel through the fabric when you make your initial stitch. Now it's almost time to start embroidering, but do not forget to put your finger protectors on. I'm not joking, these are an absolute lifesaver and you'll definitely thank me after you finish this project. The first step of this embroidery project is embroidering the larger half flowers. If you're using the downloadable embroidery PDF as a guide, you will have sketched everything out onto the shoe already, but as you can see, I'm just freehanding this design. And for these larger flowers, I'm stitching the petals with large lazy daisy stitches. These are really long lazy daisy stitches. They're usually much smaller, and I'll be showing you smaller ones later on in this project. My left hand is kind of in the way of the lighting here. Don't worry, I'm going to move it in a second. It's a little hard sometimes to film these really in-depth shoe embroidery tutorials. I'm really nearsighted, so when I embroider, usually I have the shoes really close to my face. So filming tutorials is sometimes a little bit challenging because I have to make sure the shoes are in the right place so the camera can capture everything that I'm doing. The key to really great lazy daisy stitches, and I'll probably repeat this a couple times in this video, is making sure not to anchor them too tightly. If you make your anchor stitch at the apex of the petal really tight, it's gonna just pull those two strands of thread together rather than creating a loop. It's gonna just look like a straight line. For this larger flower, I'm doing 8 petals, and you want to just make sure that these are all the same size. Again, if you have sketched this design out first, just follow the design that you've sketched. But if you're feeling brave and you're going to freehand it like me, just do your best to make sure that they're all the same size. It's really going to make a difference in the end result of this flower. By stitching the top, the bottom, and the middle petal first, you kind of give yourself a framework to work off, and then it's kind of like going around the semicircle to fill it up with petals. As I said at the beginning of this video, this is one of the longer tutorials that I filmed, so I think even I am going to struggle to yap my way through this and make sure that you guys don't have too many silences with the background music playing as I stitch. But I did want to make sure that this was a really comprehensive tutorial. I wanted to make sure that I wasn't cutting out too much of the footage. I wanted you to see every single stitch that I make. I did also want to include some not so perfect moments, like when my thread knots, because that is really realistic. Your thread is going to knot several times doing a project like this, and if it does, don't worry. Try pulling on it gently in a couple of different directions and it usually will come loose. If not, you're gonna have to cut your losses, trim that thread, rethread your needle, and start again from the same spot. I'm a super visual learner, so I like to watch really in-depth tutorials like this on other crafts when I'm learning. So I hope that this can give you some good visuals if you are struggling with some of these stitches. So just before I get done with all of these petals, you can see I run out of thread. I'm going to show you quickly how I tie off my thread and secure it in the shoe before I rethread my needle and I continue stitching this flower. I like to loop my needle among the inner stitches inside the shoe a couple of times, let's say 2 to 3 times, and then I do that again another 2 to 3 times, but I make knots in those loops. Then I trim off the excess thread and I continue on my embroidery project. This method is foolproof. I've never had anybody come back to me and say that their threads came loose in their shoes after wearing them, so I would 100% recommend this method. The smaller half flower towards the bottom of the shoe is going to have less petals and they're going to be a little bit smaller. Keep this in mind when you're embroidering. Again, try and make sure all of these petals are the same size. We're just using the same stitch, some longer lazy daisy stitches, all centered around one point and kind of arching in a semicircle. This is what you should be left with on the outside of your shoes once you are finished with the larger half flower and the smaller half flower. Next, we're going to go in with this slightly darker blue. We're using 2 strands of this thread, so don't forget to split off 2 strands away from the remaining 4. And we're using this slightly darker color to stitch the smaller florals that go on either side of these flowers and also in the middle of the ones that we just stitched. Again, we're using the lazy daisy stitch, but as you can see, these stitches are much smaller than the ones we just used. And we're basically working around a center point and adding 5 petals using the lazy daisy stitch. Again, we want to make sure all of these petals are the same size. That's kind of crucial for the end result. And again, remember not to anchor these too tightly. We want them to resemble petals. You'll see me do this a couple of times in this tutorial. If you're not happy with the shape achieved by your lazy daisy stitch, you can go back in with your needle and just play around with the thread a little bit. Tug it on either side of that anchor stitch to perfect the loop shape. And once you are happy with the loop shape, you can tug your thread a little bit to secure that perfect loop shape that you just made. Here I'm going to show you the technique I use to kind of tuck my thread in along the shoe as I move to a different area to stitch. What we really want to avoid are long stretches of thread that can get caught by your foot when putting your foot into the shoes. So by tucking your thread in along the inner material of the shoe, it just helps to keep the inside of the shoe really neat. I'm going to be using this same color thread for the pollen of the larger flowers we stitched before these smaller ones. And to achieve this, we'll do 1 French knot stitch in the center of these half flowers. For the larger flower, wrap your thread around your needle 3 times to achieve a slightly larger French knot, and then once I get to the smaller flower, you'll see I only wrap it around the needle twice. Once you're done with the French knot, it's time to stitch the remaining flowers, and don't forget the other French knot in the center of the smaller half flower. This is what you should be left with after stitching those smaller daisy flowers onto your shoe. Next, I'm going to rethread more of that light blue thread that we used for the half flowers, and I'm going to make some French knots in the center of the smaller flowers we just stitched. Again, use the same technique as you did with the French knots we just did, but for these French knots, we'll only wrap the thread around the needle twice. Since these flowers are quite small, we want the pollen in the center to be quite small and dainty too. Again, don't forget to tuck your thread inside the shoe a couple of times on your way to the next flower. I can't tell you how much this really helps keep the insides of the shoes neat. It also saves you a lot of time because you don't have to be cutting off and securing your thread between each embroidery section, if that makes sense. You can continue with the same strand of thread and also make sure that you have no super long loose threads within the shoes. Next, we're going to go in with this dark navy blue. Again, we'll need 2 strands of this, so don't forget to separate it away from the rest of the embroidery thread. And now we're just adding in some really small accent flowers between the flowers we've already stitched. For these flowers, we're going to be using the straight stitch, and each of these flowers will have 8 petals. And these flowers are super simple since we're just using the straight stitch. Each stitch will be a petal, and they'll all be converging in the center to make a cute little accent flower. I really like these flowers because they're super simple but very effective. As you can see, they're kind of like the perfect filler between these slightly larger flowers that we've already stitched. And I also think that this navy blue is a great example of using different tones and hues of the same color. Since this shoe is a something blue bridal design, I obviously wanted to use a lot of blues when embroidering this. And all of the different colored blues really complement each other nicely. By only using a small splash of this really dark color, I'm kind of bringing out the lighter colors a bit more. I don't know, I'm not like a professional color analysis person, but I think it looks kind of nice, right? Once you're done stitching all of those smaller accent flowers, you should have a little something that looks like this. And I always say I love how this looks even without adding the green leaves, which is going to be one of our next steps. So if you're looking for a slightly simpler embroidery design, you could just end your project here. I think it looks fantastic if you do want to do that. If not, follow these next steps. We're going to stitch some branches and then some leaves onto those branches. This is just a really quick shot of how the inside of the shoes look so far. As you can see, there's no thread hanging anywhere, nothing that can get caught or snag when you stick your foot into the shoe. Okay, so now we're going to be using this brown to stitch the branches. If you just want greenery on your shoes, you don't have to make this color different to the color that you're using for the leaves, but I kind of like it. It breaks up the greenery a little bit and gives a little bit of contrast to the design. Again, I'm using 2 strands of this thread, so don't forget to separate it away. For the branches, I like to do a lot of couch stitching, which is basically just making one long stitch and then making smaller anchor stitches along the curve of that long stitch that you made, kind of just to secure it in the kind of curve that you want it to follow. You can just achieve this same look with a few back stitches, but not only do I prefer the way a curved couch stitch looks, it also takes a lot less time than a bunch of back stitches. Again, don't forget to use the tucking method inside the shoe and make sure that you don't leave a bunch of loose thread hanging about everywhere. This is really important to remember, especially when stitching the branches and the leaves, since they span from the very top of the shoe to the very bottom of the shoe. Once you're done stitching your branches, we're going to go in with the color green that we want to use for the leaves. I'm using a darker green here, more of like a hunter green, but I also find that a sage green looks really nice with this kind of design with these blues. And you guessed it, we are using more lazy daisy stitches. I love a good lazy daisy stitch, I can't lie. And this design is very lazy daisy stitch heavy. So for the leaves, we're basically just doing the same stitch in a very similar size to those slightly darker blue flowers we stitched after the large half flowers. And again, I can't stress enough, do not be afraid to go back in with your needle and kind of play around with the thread once you've made the lazy daisy stitch and you've anchored it. This is going to make sure you achieve the perfect looped leaf shapes. And it can feel a little time consuming. When I was watching this video back as I was editing it, I was kind of caught off guard by how many times I go back in with my needle and make sure that my lazy daisy stitches are perfect, but it's really going to reflect in the final result for this design. I also found it really interesting that I use my thumb a lot without even realizing. When I'm stitching lazy daisy stitches, my thumb kind of acts as a way to stop the thread from going all the way through the fabric when I pull on it, so that there's definitely a loop left over for me to hook my needle back into and create the lazy daisy stitch. So feel free to steal this technique that I wasn't even aware that I was doing. This is also a great time to mention that you don't have to work with very, very long stretches of thread. Your thread is more prone to tangling and knotting when you're embroidering if you're working with a really long piece of thread. I recommend keeping it at about a forearm's length. This is definitely going to make your life easier. It does mean that you will have to secure your thread inside the shoe and rethread it a few more times than if you used longer stretches of thread. But when embroidery thread knots and tangles, it can be really frustrating, so I would definitely recommend starting off with some shorter cuts, especially for one of your first projects. Another fun thing I like to do sometimes is actually use a couple different shades of green when I'm stitching greenery onto this kind of design. Using 2 or even 3 different hues of green can add some real depth to a design like this. And if you have a little bit more time to play around with this design, you can even fill these lazy daisy stitches up with a couple of satin stitches to make your leaves more of a solid than this hollow leaf shape that we currently have. Once you're finished stitching your leaves onto the outsides of the shoes, you should be left with something like this. And then it's time to move on to stitching the insides of the shoes. We're going to be working around the Converse logo, and we're going to be using all the same colors, all the same stitches that were used on the outsides of the shoes, just in a different formation. So I'm going to show you how exactly to do that. We're going to do 2 larger half flowers, and they're basically going to mirror each other on either side of this Converse logo. Again, make sure you try and get those lazy daisy stitches to be the same size, and each of these half flowers is going to have 7 petals. Once you're done stitching these half flowers, we're going to go back in with that slightly darker blue. And yes, we are going to do some more lazy daisy stitches. These ones are going to be the smaller ones for those smaller flowers. And we're doing 2 of these smaller flowers kind of parallel to the center of the Converse logo, just to the right of the large half flower that we stitched at the top of the logo. Then once you're done with those smaller flowers, don't forget to add the French knots in the center of those half flowers we stitched before. For this pollen, we're just going to be wrapping the thread around the needle twice since they're a little bit smaller than the large half flower on the outside of the shoes. Again, don't forget to tuck your thread on the way to the other half flower on the bottom of the shoe. I feel like I'm being quite annoying about that technique, but it is seriously super essential. Now it's time to add 2 more French knots, one in the center of each of those slightly darker blue flowers. Again, we're wrapping the thread around our needle twice for these. After you've stitched that light blue pollen, we're going back in with the darker navy color and just doing one of those little filler, super easy straight stitch flowers. And that's again going to be parallel to the center of the Converse logo, just above those slightly darker blue flowers we just stitched. The next step is to stitch the branches that kind of encapsulate the Converse logo. Again, more couch stitching here, and don't be afraid to add as many anchor stitches as you think you might need. You want the curve to be perfect and to match up with the curve of the logo. That's going to make your design look the best, in my opinion. I kind of like it when the branches look as if they're growing from the flowers, which is why I kind of have the branches merging into some of the petals from that lower half flower. And then the next step is to stitch those leaves again with the lazy daisy stitch. Depending on your shoe size, you might have a slightly smaller Converse logo to work with, and that is going to affect the number of leaves you're able to put on your branches. So don't worry if you're looking at this and you're like, there's no way I can fit that many leaves around my Converse logo. Once you finish up embroidering those leaves on the inside of the shoe, you are done with one shoe. Give yourself a pat on the back, maybe some snacks, a little break, and then continue with the next shoe. I finished the next shoe off camera because this took me a good few hours to film, but the process is exactly the same, so just follow the steps that you already completed on the one shoe. This is how the insides of my shoes look after I'm totally finished with embroidering. I know a lot of people are really curious about this, so I like to show this at the end of my tutorials. I really hope you found this tutorial helpful. simple, and I really hope it maybe gave you some confidence to try this at home. I do love reading your comments, so if there's anything that you'd like to say to me, any tutorials you'd like to see in the future, please let me know in the comments. If you haven't already, I would so appreciate it if you would leave a like on this video. I really think it does something to the YouTube algorithm, and it helps push my videos out to other people who might want to learn how to embroider too. My nana taught me how to embroider when I was just 7 years old, and I'm turning 29 this year, so it's been quite a long journey for me, and I would love to help other people in starting their own hand embroidery journeys too. I have a bunch more hand embroidery tutorials coming up. I have a couple that I'm editing right now and others that I'm planning out. So if you enjoyed this video, I would definitely consider subscribing to my channel. I make a lot of embroidery tutorials and small business related content. And if you want to join this crafty little corner of the internet, I would absolutely love to have you. Again, thank you so much for watching, and I will see you again in my next video.